For 4 years, Wren had not spoken a single word. Then one morning his mother heard him outside, talking in full sentences to something standing at the fence. By the time she reached the window, the horse was already watching her back. Celia had learned not to run. Running startled Wren, and startling Wren meant the rest of the day would unspool in ways that were hard to recover from. So she moved quickly, but carefully, the way she did everything now, measuring herself against an invisible threshold she could feel but never see. She pressed her palm flat against the kitchen window glass. The condensation from her coffee mug had fogged the lower corner, and she wiped it with her sleeve and looked out. Her son was standing at the fence at the edge of their property. He was wearing his yellow rain boots, the ones he refused to take off even in summer, and his arms were hanging loose at his sides in that particular way of his, not tense, not relaxed, just present. His head was tilted slightly to the right, and he was talking, not the sounds he sometimes made, not the low, cycling hum that meant he was content, or the sharp percussive clicks that meant the opposite. He was talking. His mouth was moving in the unmistakable rhythm of language, of sentences, of one thought connected deliberately to another. And on the other side of the fence stood a horse Celia had never seen before. It was gray, the kind of gray that is almost white in certain light and almost silver in others, and it stood perfectly still, its head lowered slightly, at an angle that looked less like grazing and more like listening. It was not small. It was not tame looking, but it had come to within 4 feet of the fence where Wren was standing, and it had not moved. Celia set her coffee mug down on the counter without taking her eyes off the window. Her son had not spoken a word since the age of 5. He was 9 now. The silence had not arrived all at once, the way people seemed to expect. It had come in stages, like a tide going out, and by the time they understood what was happening, the words were already gone. Therapists had different names for what Wren was experiencing. She had read everything she could find. She had sat across from specialists who spoke carefully and made no promises. She had eventually stopped waiting for the words to come back and started learning to love the person her son was without them. And now he was standing at the fence in his yellow boots at 7:43 in the morning, talking to a horse that didn't belong to anyone, on a property that bordered nothing but a state forest that stretched for 11 miles in every direction. She could not hear what he was saying. The window was closed. The glass was between them. She did not open the door. She stood there and watched and understood, with a kind of certainty that came from somewhere below thought that if she went outside, she would end it. Whatever this was, it was fragile in a way she recognized, the way a soap bubble is fragile, the way a dream is fragile in the last seconds before waking. She pressed her forehead gently against the glass and watched her son talk to a horse in the early morning light, and she did not move. Wren talked for 11 minutes. She timed it on the microwave clock. When he stopped, he stepped back from the fence slowly, the way he did when he was satisfied with something. He picked up a stick from the ground, turned it over in his hands twice, set it back down with precision. Then he walked back toward the house. The horse watched him go. It stood at the fence for another 2 minutes after Wren went inside, its head still angled toward the door he had entered. Then it turned and moved back toward the tree line at a pace that was unhurried, unbothered, and in no way resembling the behavior of an animal that had wandered somewhere accidentally. By noon it was gone, and by the following night, so was Mara. The farm had been Celia's parents' farm before it was hers, and before that it had been her grandfather's, which meant it had been built for a version of life that bore very little resemblance to the one she was currently living. The house was large in the way that farmhouses are large, not elegant but honest, designed around function in winter and the kind of tiredness that comes from work rather than grief. There were rooms she had stopped using. A barn she kept locked, not because it was unsafe, but because she could not yet figure out what to do with what was inside it. Her father's tools, her grandfather's harnesses, the smell of old wood and grease, and something that should have been ordinary, but wasn't anymore. A backfield that nobody had planted in 6 years, gone over now to tall grass and thistle, and a single leaning apple tree at the far corner that still bloomed every May without anyone asking it to. She had moved back after her husband, Theo, died. That was 2 years ago now. Though there were mornings, it felt like much longer, and other mornings, when it felt like something that had happened last week to someone in another room. Theo had died in a way that was very quick and offered no preparation and left behind the specific, bewildering aftermath of a loss that the body understands before the mind does. He had been 41. He had been the kind of man who fixed things before they broke, who remembered the names of people he had met once, who made terrible coffee and knew it and made it anyway because he liked the ritual of it. He had been the first person outside of Celia who could read Wren. That was the part she didn't talk about. Not to the grief counselor she had seen for 3 months, not to her sister who called every Sunday, not to anyone. The part where Wren lost not just a father, but an interpreter. Because what Theo had with Wren was harder to name than love, though it was that too. It was something more specific, a fluency. He knew when Wren's silences were content and when they were distress. He knew the 2 distinct rhythms of the humming and what each one meant. He knew that the blocks were not random, that the patterns Wren built with them had internal logic and even sometimes apparent intention. He had spent 5 years paying attention and had arrived at a kind of understanding that Celia was still working toward. And then he was gone, and she was working toward it alone. And some days, the loneliness of that was manageable, and other days it was not. Before Theo died, they had lived in the city. An apartment on the 4th floor of a building in a neighborhood that was loud in the particular overlapping way of urban spaces, traffic and restaurants, and someone's music and the specific percussion of other people's lives coming through walls and ceilings and floors. It was not the right place for Wren, though they had tried hard to make it work, which meant years of thick curtains and sound machines and careful management of every sensory variable they could control. And the ones they couldn't control, like the fire alarm in the building next door that went off randomly on Tuesday mornings, and the neighbor who owned a dog that barked in a register that set Wren's whole nervous system on edge in a way that no amount of preparation or preemption could ease. After Theo died, she had needed somewhere quieter, and the farm was quiet, and she had come home in the way that people come home to places they weren't sure they loved until they needed them. The farm was quiet in a way the city was not. The farm was quiet in a way that had texture, wind and creek water and bird sound, and the kind of deep, nighttime dark that you can only find when there are no streetlights, when the absence of light is not a problem to be solved, but simply the way things are. Wren had responded to it within the first week in ways that were small but visible. A slight loosening around the edges of him, a willingness to be outside that had not existed before. She had not realized, when she was growing up here, that quiet was something she was inheriting along with the land. Mara had adapted. Mara adapted to most things. She was 12, with her father's dark eyes and her grandmother's jaw, and a stubbornness that sat beneath her usual composure. Like a stone at the bottom of clear water, you could see it, but it rarely broke the surface. She had spent the first months after the move conducting what she called personal research about the forest, which in practice meant coming home from the trails with her pockets full of things. Pine cones and pressed leaves and unusual pieces of lichen and small smooth stones from the creek bed. And, once, a very old bird skull that was so complete and so perfectly preserved that she had spent an entire evening looking up what kind it was. A barred owl, she had concluded from the shape of the eye sockets, and had placed it on her windowsill with what Celia could only describe as reverence. She treated it like something that had been left for her. She had made one friend at the new school, a girl named Pip, whose full name was Philippa, and who had a gap between her front teeth, and who had found Mara on the first day of school, standing outside looking at a piece of moss on the wall, and had said, without preamble, "That's called reindeer lichen. It's not actually a moss. It's a symbiosis." They had been inseparable for 4 months. Then Pip's family had moved to a different state, a relocation that was sudden and not entirely explained, and Mara had handled it the way Mara handled most things that hurt her, by saying almost nothing, by processing it in complete interior privacy, and by staying up past midnight for 3 consecutive weeks reading books she had already read, which was her specific version of retreating. Celia had watched this happen and had not known how to intervene. Mara's grief was not the kind that asked to be witnessed. She was very much her father's daughter in that way, and part of what made it hard was that Celia recognized in Mara exactly the kind of stoicism that she had once found admirable in Theo, and now understood was also a kind of loneliness. Wren worshipped Mara in the way that people worship things they cannot quite explain and will not let themselves examine too closely, for fear that understanding will diminish it. He followed her from room to room when she was home. He sat outside her bedroom door when she was reading, his back against the wall, his knees drawn up, sometimes for an hour at a stretch. When Mara sang under her breath while doing dishes, Wren would come and stand in the kitchen doorway and go completely still, with an expression that Celia had come to think of as his listening face. Eyes slightly unfocused, head tilted right, body quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet. It was a face of active reception. It was a face that said, "I am not absent. I am entirely here." It was the same face he had worn at the fence that morning. What Celia did not know, because Mara had kept it from her deliberately, and with a teenager's particular capacity for compartmentalization, was that her daughter had been going into the forest alone for several months. Not for long stretches. Not past dusk, never past dusk. Mara was stubborn, but she was not reckless, and she had spent enough time in that forest to have developed a working respect for it. She understood the difference between the forest in afternoon light and the forest at twilight and the forest after dark. She understood that the path she had found was not marked and that no one else used it regularly. She understood that if she sprained her ankle or got turned around, the margin for error was thinner than it would be somewhere with infrastructure. But there was the overlook, and the overlook was worth it. She had found the path by accident the previous autumn, following a deer trail she had spotted from the main trail, which she had been exploring on her own since their first month at the farm. The path climbed east along a ridge line through a section of old-growth hemlock, the trees enormous and close, and filtering the light into something almost ecclesiastical, the forest floor beneath them bare of undergrowth and softened by decades of accumulated needles. The path followed the ridge for about 20 minutes before arriving at a natural ledge, a flat shelf of rock that jutted out over the ravine at an angle that offered a view she had not expected and could not have described to anyone in a way that did it justice. The whole valley opened below. In the late afternoon, the light came in from the southwest at an angle that turned the valley floor amber and deep gold, and the shadows of the hills on the eastern side reached across it in long blue-gray lines. And from 14 feet above the ravine floor, it looked like something painted and then left to be found. She had carved her initials next to the ones already in the stone. Below them, faded and deep, were other initials from other years. Other people who had found this place and felt what she felt, that this was worth remembering, that you wanted to leave some proof you had been here. She had not told Celia about any of this. She had known Celia would say no, not because the trail was dangerous in any absolute sense, but because Celia's relationship with the forest had changed after Theo died. The forest was where Theo and Celia used to walk on Sunday mornings before the kids were awake, before the day required anything. She had stopped going anywhere near the tree line after he died, and Mara had noticed this, the way children notice things they are not supposed to understand, silently, with an accuracy that adults would find alarming if they knew. So Mara had told Wren instead, not in the way you tell a secret to someone you trust to keep it. Not strategically, not as a disclosure. Mara told Wren things the way other people write in diaries, because the telling needed to happen, and because Wren received it without reacting, and because his room, with its familiar smell, and its wooden blocks, and its low-frequency constancy, was the safest place she knew. She had been doing it for years, long before the farm. Back in the apartment, she had sat in his room when the world felt like too much and talked about nothing and everything. And over time, the nothing and everything had become specific. School, Pip leaving, the bird skull, the initials in the stone, her father, the sound of his voice, the specific shape of the absence he had left behind in every room of whatever place they lived. She talked about the overlook, about the light, about the old stone wall and the date carved there 1887, and about who might have stood in that exact spot 130 years ago and looked at the same valley and felt the same way she felt, which was small and also somehow exactly the right size for the world. She told him about the last time she went, 4 days before she disappeared. She had gone in the late afternoon, later than usual, because she had lost track of time doing her schoolwork. The light at the overlook was already thinning. She had stood at the edge of the shelf and looked down, and that was when she had seen the lower path, a narrow line of disturbed earth on the south face of the ravine, barely visible from above, descending through the undergrowth toward the ravine floor. It looked man-made old. It looked like something that had been used once and then forgotten. She told Wren she had thought about going down it. She told him she hadn't, because the light was going and she needed to be home for dinner. But she kept thinking about it. She thought about it while she was going to sleep. She thought about where it led. It looked like the kind of path that kept going, even when it stopped looking like one. Wren had been arranging his blocks during this conversation. He did not look at her. He did not turn his head, did not shift his body, did not give any sign that she was distinguishable from the general atmosphere of the room. He picked up a wooden cube with 2 fingers, considered it, placed it with a small precise click at the corner of the structure he had been building for 3 days, and then reached for another. Mara talked until she didn't have anything left to say, and then she sat for a while in the quiet, and then she got up and kissed the top of her brother's head the way she had since he was 3 and she was 5, and they were still figuring out what they were to each other. He did not look up. She went to her room and wrote another letter she would not send. He was always listening. He was always listening, and this was the part that no specialist or therapist or well-intentioned adult had ever found a way to account for. The part that existed below the threshold of what tests could measure and what observation could confirm. Wren's silence had never been emptiness. It had always been the opposite of emptiness. It was accumulation, layering, a kind of inner archive that received everything and returned nothing through the ordinary channels, and so was interpreted, consistently and incorrectly, as absence. He knew where his sister had gone. He had known since the moment Celia showed him the note. What he had not known, until the morning the gray horse came back to the fence, was how to lead anyone there. The gray horse had not come from any neighboring property. Celia checked. There were 3 farms within 5 miles of hers, and none of them had a gray horse, and none of them had reported a missing animal. She called the County Agricultural Extension Office and described what she had seen, the color, the size, the absence of markings or halter or any sign of ownership. The woman on the phone said horses did occasionally escape from trailering accidents along the state route, and that she would post a notice. But her tone suggested she found the situation unremarkable, and was already thinking about whoever called next. Celia found nothing unremarkable about it. She sat across from Wren at dinner that night and watched him eat. He ate the way he always ate, methodically, foods not touching, the same order always. Protein first, then grain, then whatever vegetable she had made, each element finished before he moved to the next, as though there were rules governing the sequence that existed independently of her opinion about them. He ate with the fork in his left hand, even though she had been told he was right-handed, and she had never been able to work out whether this was preference or something else. He ate without looking at her, mostly. Then he put his fork down, looked at the window for a long moment, and got up and put his plate in the sink, the way he always did. The way that made the day feel, at least in that moment, stable and continuous. She had been waiting 9 years for her son to talk. 9 years, measured in appointments and assessments and conversations with people who had more certainty in their voices than their information seemed to warrant, and in the quieter interior measurement of all the moments she had watched her son's face and tried to understand what he was experiencing and arrived at approximations she could never verify. She had learned to read his silences, or believed she had. She had learned to differentiate between the humming that meant contentment and the humming that meant something approaching distress, between the particular quality of his stillness when he was deeply focused and the quality of it when he had gone somewhere she could not follow. She had learned all of this the way you learn anything important, which is slowly and imperfectly, and with the persistent awareness that you are probably still missing something. Whatever had happened at that fence that morning was not nothing. She was not going to treat it as nothing. Mara ate her dinner quickly and asked to be excused early. Celia let her go. She had seemed distracted all week, not the focused, leaning in distraction she wore when she was reading something that interested her, but a more internal distraction, the quality of a person turning something over and over without being ready to put it down. Celia had assumed it was about Pip. The 1-year mark of Pip's departure was 3 weeks away, and Mara tracked these dates the way certain people track weather systems, not by checking, but by feeling the pressure change. She told herself she would find a moment to ask, tomorrow, over breakfast, when there was time. She fell asleep that night with the lamp on, which she had not done since the months right after Theo died, when falling asleep felt like a betrayal of wakefulness, when she had needed the light the way some people need sound. She did not hear the back door. She did not hear her daughter dress in the dark, lace up her boots by feel, take the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the good one, with the new batteries, and walk across the yard in the direction she had been walking alone for months. She did not know any of this until 6:15 in the morning, when she went to Mara's room and found the bed empty, the covers pushed back, the pillow with the small depression of a head that had recently been there, and on the pillow, folded once, a sheet torn from a notebook. Went to the overlook. Back by breakfast. Don't worry. Celia stood in the doorway with a note in her hand. She read it twice, then a third time, and it was on the third reading that she noticed the absence of a comma before don't worry, which was not the way Mara wrote. Mara was meticulous about punctuation. It was a small thing. But Celia had been reading the small things for so long that they had become a language in themselves, and she did not dismiss the feeling this gave her. She stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. Then she picked up her phone. What followed existed in a register she would later find difficult to describe. Not panic exactly, though she understood panic was nearby, that she was adjacent to it in the way you're adjacent to a wall in a dark room, sensing its presence before you touch it. What she actually felt was something more like the opposite of panic, a sudden terrible sharpening of everything. Every edge in the room looked sharper. Every distance looked precise. Her mind organized itself with a clarity that felt borrowed, the kind of clarity the body lends you when it has decided that falling apart is not currently permitted. She called Mara's phone. 4 rings. Voicemail. Mara's voice, recorded months ago, sounding slightly self-conscious the way 12-year-olds do. "Hi, it's Mara. Leave a message." Celia hung up and called again. Same. She went outside in her socked feet and called Mara's name toward the tree line. Her voice went into the forest, and the forest gave nothing back. She called the sheriff's department. The deputy was a man whose tone conveyed that he had taken many calls like this one, and was managing both her and his own protocol simultaneously, and that both were fine. He told her that for a 12-year-old who had left a note indicating a specific destination, the department's protocols required waiting until a clearer threshold had passed. He said noon. He said call back at noon if she hadn't heard, and they would initiate a full search at that point. He said he was writing everything down. He asked her to describe what Mara had been wearing. Celia told him what she assumed. Dark jacket, red hiking boots, jeans, maybe the waterproof pants. She was not certain because she had not seen Mara leave. Noon was 6 hours away. 6 hours in that moment had the quality of something measured in a different currency than the one she was currently using. She went to wake Ren. She knocked 3 times, said his name, turned the overhead light to its lowest setting. He woke the way he always woke, slowly and then all at once, sitting up with a suddenness that still startled her slightly after all these years. He looked at her face first, and at the window, then at her hands, which held the note. She held it out to him. She could not have said later exactly why she did this. She knew it was not standard practice. She knew that showing a child in distress a crisis note was not in any guidebook she had read. She did it because she was holding it, and he was looking at her, and she did not know what else to offer. And perhaps because some part of her that was older than her conscious reasoning already understood what she was doing. He looked at the note. His eyes moved. He read it once, and then he read it again. And on the second reading, his face changed in a way she had almost never seen it change. A gathering, an inward focusing, like a hand closing around something. He put his feet on the floor. He put on his yellow boots, which were beside his bed, because they were always beside his bed. He walked to the back door and stopped. He looked at her. The look lasted 3 seconds. It was not a look of fear, or of uncertainty, or of a child asking to be told what to do. It was the look of someone who knows the way and is waiting to find out if the person behind them is ready to follow. She was. She went back to her room for her boots, her phone, the extra fleece. When she came back out, Ren was already moving across the yard toward the fence, and the gray horse was already in the field, crossing the damp October grass at a walk, heading directly for the fence line where her son was going to stand. She stopped in the middle of the yard and watched them converge. The horse arrived at the fence a few seconds after Ren did. It stopped, head up, the gray of it pale and distinct against the darker tree line behind the field, and it looked at Ren the way it had looked at him the morning before, with an attention that was not the passive attention of an animal waiting to be fed, but something more focused, more deliberate, harder to describe in language that didn't sound like projection. Ren spoke to it again. She heard the shape of it, the rhythm of a sentence, one of them short. And then the horse turned its head toward the tree line, and the horse turned its body, and it began walking toward the gap in the fence corner. Ren followed it without looking back at her. She followed Ren. There are moments when a decision that would normally require deliberation has already been made by something in you that doesn't consult the deliberating part. She had no explanation for what she was doing. She had a missing daughter and a horse that came from nowhere, and a son who had not spoken for 4 years and had suddenly, in the last 18 hours, done so twice, and she was going to walk into the forest behind both of them, and she did not need to understand it to do it. She walked into the trees with Ren 12 feet ahead of her, and the horse 12 feet ahead of him, and the forest closed over all of them, and the farm disappeared behind. The trail entered, and then disappeared, and then reappeared, the way old paths do, never quite gone, never quite obvious, requiring a kind of tracking attention that she had not used since childhood. The horse moved through it with authority, choosing at each small ambiguity, each fork, each place where the path blurred into the undergrowth, without hesitation, always choosing correctly, in the sense that the ground ahead of it always resolved into a path rather than a tangle. She tried Mara's phone again. Voicemail. She texted the deputy her GPS coordinates and said she was following a trail east of the property. He asked if she wanted a search team. She said yes. She said she was already in the forest. He said 45 minutes to an hour. She put the phone back in her pocket and kept walking. The forest here was old in the way that forests are old, when they have not been managed or logged in a long time. The trees large and independent seeming, the canopy complex, the undergrowth filling every available space with a density that was not hostile, but simply itself, growing because growing was what it did. The light under the canopy was directionless and gray, and had that quality of October mornings in the Northeast, where the sun has risen but not yet established any authority, where everything is illuminated and nothing is warm. Wren walked with his arms loose at his sides, the yellow boots finding the soft spots in the path and avoiding them, which she would not have expected from a 9-year-old who spent most of his time in rooms. He did not look back. He kept his eyes on the horse, which kept its eyes forward, and the three of them moved in a loose single file through the old forest with a coherence that felt less accidental than it looked. She checked her phone again. 15 minutes in. She sent the deputy her location and kept going. The path climbed. It climbed steadily along what she understood, as the trees thinned at the top of the grade, was a ridge, the land dropping sharply on the east side, the first glimpse of the ravine below, visible through breaks in the tree cover. Rock in shadow, and far below, the silver gray of the creek, moving fast in the way of October water after rain. The drop from the ridge path to the ravine floor was not uniform. In some places it was graded, manageable if you were careful. In others, it was essentially a wall. She kept her eyes on the yellow boots. Wren had made no sound since they entered the forest. Not the humming, not the clicks, not anything. He was entirely silent and entirely focused, and the focus had a quality she had only seen in him in certain specific moments. The moments when he was not absent, but more present than usual, more present than most people are capable of being. A hyper-presence that ordinary language didn't have a word for. She noticed when the horse slowed. It slowed without any visible cue and angled slightly off the main trail toward a secondary path that she would have walked past. The secondary path went downward into the ravine, downward toward the ravine floor, toward the creek. A new understanding arrived in her chest. Not the understanding of her mind, which was still running calculations, still telling her this could mean anything, still offering her the comfortable option of skepticism. The understanding of her body, which had stopped offering her that option. Wren stepped onto the lower path without breaking stride. She followed him. The descent was steep and loose-footed in places, and she used the small trees and the root systems for handholds, planting her feet sideways on the steeper sections, moving more slowly than Wren and the horse, who navigated it with a sure-footedness she could only watch with a kind of helpless admiration. The canopy closed over them again on the descent, and then opened, and they emerged onto a flat rock shelf above the ravine floor, and she saw the valley open below her, and the creek, and the boulder at the creek's edge, and Mara wedged against it. She heard her before she fully processed what she was seeing, a small sound, repetitive, the sound of something maintained rather than created, the residue of hours of trying reduced to its essential element. Celia was at the edge of the shelf, Before she knew she had moved, Mara was 12 feet below her. She was sitting upright. She was alive. Her left leg was extended at an angle that nobody extends their leg voluntarily, and her face was the particular pale of cold and prolonged stillness, the bloodlessness of a body that has been directing its heat inward for hours. Her jacket was wrapped around her torso with the sleeves used as extra insulation. Her eyes, when they found Celia's face above her, were clear. "I knew someone would come," Mara said. Her voice was smaller than usual, but not frightened. It had the quality of a statement that has been waiting a long time to be made. "I'm here," Celia said. "Don't move." "I'm right here." She was already on her phone, and her hands were shaking now in the way they had not shaken all morning, because the worst possible outcome had become unavailable, and the body, released from the impossible task of preventing it, had finally been allowed to react. What happened next had a specific procedural quality to it that Celia would later be grateful for, because the procedural quality meant she did not have time to feel the full weight of it until afterward. She called 911. She kept Mara talking. She descended the last few feet of the ravine carefully, gripping a root, and she sat beside her daughter and held her hand and kept her talking while the light shifted and the forest made its morning sounds around them. Mara had gone to the overlook in the dark, which she had done once before, and which she knew was a poor decision. And she had taken the lower path she had told Wren about, and she had gone farther than she intended. And in the dark on the descent, she had placed her foot where she thought there was solid ground, and there wasn't, and she had fallen. Not far, far enough. She had been there for 9 hours. To understand what 9 hours at the floor of a ravine in October is, you have to understand what cold does over time, which is not what most people imagine. It does not arrive like a wave and overwhelm you. It arrives like a conversation that becomes more one-sided as the hours pass, beginning with the kind of cold that is merely uncomfortable, and progressing through the kind that requires active management, moving your feet, controlling your breathing, keeping your arms close, and then into the kind that wants something from you that you are not sure you have. Mara had understood from the first hour that the cold was the most immediate problem. Her leg was a problem too, but the leg was a problem that was already decided, already done, requiring only endurance. The cold required active response. She had moved her arms inside her jacket as soon as she understood that she was staying until morning. She had pulled leaves toward her with the arm that could reach, piling them across her legs and her feet, understanding that even small insulation was better than none. She had the flashlight for 2 hours, long enough to assess the ravine walls around her and understand that climbing out on her own was not possible, not with the leg, and that the path she had come down was, from below, invisible. She had checked her phone every 20 minutes for the first 4 hours, watching the battery decline and the no-service indicator remain. She had rationed the checking after that. She had thought about her mother. She had thought about Wren. She had thought about her father. She had thought about her father in the way she thought about him at the overlook, not with the raw weight of the early grief, which had been too large and too shapeless to carry directly, but with something more specific. She thought about his hands, which had been precise and patient in the way of a person who builds and fixes things. She thought about the way he used to sit on the floor of Wren's room and arrange blocks alongside Wren without making it into a lesson or an exercise, just sitting there building something, companionably and without agenda. She thought about how Wren had been different after he died, and how she had never been able to tell whether Wren understood the loss in the way she understood it, or whether his grief traveled through some other channel, arriving at a different destination. She had thought, someone will come. She had thought this not as a wish or a hope, but as a kind of calculation. Someone would notice she was gone. Someone would know approximately where to look. The daylight would come, and with it visibility, and with visibility the possibility of rescue. She had thought this and kept thinking it throughout the night, repeating it at intervals the way you repeat a prayer, not because prayer is magic, but because the act of repeating something gives it the quality of something real. Someone will come. And at approximately 7:50 in the morning, she had heard her name, not clearly, not in a voice she recognized immediately. From above, and then closer, and then close enough that she had found herself calling back without deciding to, her voice smaller than she would have liked, but there. And then the face at the edge of the shelf above her, and the particular relief of seeing her mother's face, which she had been seeing every day of her life and had never understood until that moment was something she had been taking for granted. I knew someone would come, she had said, and she had meant it. The paramedics arrived 22 minutes after Celia's 911 call. They came down the trail with equipment and the specific brisk competence of people who have done difficult terrain many times, and they assessed Mara's leg and her core temperature and her general condition with a thoroughness that Celia watched from the ravine floor beside her daughter, holding Mara's hand while they worked. Two of them. Then the sheriff's deputy, who had come with a volunteer search team, the same team that would have gone in at noon if it had come to noon. It hadn't come to noon. Getting Mara out required a stretcher, a rope system the paramedics rigged at the top of the shelf, and 45 minutes of work that was physically demanding and required concentration from everyone involved. Celia stayed at Mara's side through all of it. She talked to Mara through all of it, not about anything in particular, just the ongoing vocal presence that a person needs when they are being moved by strangers through difficult terrain with a broken leg and a body that has been cold for 9 hours. She talked about the bird skull on the windowsill. She talked about the apple tree in the backfield. She talked about the scrambled eggs at the hospital being variable in quality, but generally acceptable. She said this, and Mara, between careful, controlled exhales, almost laughed. When they lifted her onto the stretcher and got the straps secured, and she got her first unobstructed view of the sky above the ravine, Mara said it again, quietly, mostly to herself, and Celia heard it. I knew someone would come. There's something in how she said it. The certainty of it, not the hope, but the certainty, made Celia not ask. Not then. Not on the ravine floor with the paramedics working and the search team on the ridge above. Later, she told herself. She would ask later. She looked up, and Wren was at the edge of the rock shelf, looking down, standing very still with the particular quality of stillness she knew better than any other quality he had. The horse stood at the tree line behind him, half in the shadow of the hemlock. Neither of them moved. Celia raised her hand toward her son. He looked at her hand for a moment. Then he raised one of his own. It was not a wave. It was not a greeting. It was the acknowledgement of a thing completed, a task carried to its end, the closing of a loop that had opened somewhere in the forest at dawn the day before, when a gray horse appeared at a fence, and a boy who had not spoken for 4 years found something to say. The drive to the hospital took 2 hours. Celia followed the ambulance in the truck with Wren in the back seat, and Wren sat with his forehead against the window and watched the road behind them disappear, which was what he always did on long drives, as though the passing world were more interesting in retrospect than in anticipation. She drove and breathed and let the silence between them be what it was. She had not cried yet. She was aware of this. She was aware that at some point the thing that was being held in the center of her chest was going to require a release that she had not yet provided. And she was also aware that she was going to need to wait until she was somewhere that could support it, which was not a highway at 70 miles an hour with a child in the back seat and an ambulance to follow. She drove. She breathed. She looked at the ambulance's lights. At the hospital, in the waiting area outside the room where Mara was being evaluated, a nurse brought Celia coffee in a styrofoam cup, and she held it with both hands and did not drink it because drinking it would have required making a decision and she was temporarily out of capacity for decisions. Ren sat beside her. He looked at the middle distance, which was his default resting orientation, and she sat beside him and looked at her coffee and waited. After about 10 minutes, she felt his hand on her arm. Not gripping, not a child grabbing for attention. Just resting there, the specific weight of a small hand placed deliberately. The way you put your hand on something to keep it from going somewhere. She looked down at his hand on her arm. She put her other hand over his. They sat like that, in the fluorescent hum of the waiting room, until the doctor came. The doctor was a compact woman with the particular efficiency of someone who has spent years managing the gap between what families are afraid of and what is actually happening. She told Celia that Mara's leg was broken in 2 places, a fracture of the tibia and a smaller crack in the fibula, both of which were clean breaks, the kind that healed well, she said, especially in 12-year-olds, whose bones had a kind of memory for wholeness that adults gradually lost. Mild hypothermia, already treated with warming measures in the ambulance. The cut on her forehead was superficial. There was no head injury of concern. Surgery was recommended and scheduled for the following morning. She is lucky, the doctor said. Celia received the word lucky in the way she had received it at other critical moments, with the understanding that it was being offered in good faith and that her own relationship to it was more complicated than could be expressed in this particular room at this particular moment. She said, yes. She said, thank you. She followed the nurse to the room where Mara had been settled. Mara was propped up at a slight angle, her leg in a temporary immobilization brace, her color better than it had been in the ravine, though still carrying the faint gray tinge of cold and exhaustion that would take days to fully leave. There was an IV line in her right arm. The cut above her eye had been cleaned and closed with a narrow bandage. She was awake. Her eyes found Celia first, and then Ren, and something in her face changed in the way faces change when the thing they have been working to hold together is no longer required. Ren walked directly to the side of the bed. He stood there and looked at her with the expression Celia still found difficult to read. That hyperpresence, that intensity of attention, the look of a person who is entirely there in a way that most people can only approximate. Mara looked back at him. After a moment, she reached out her hand, and he took it, which was not a thing he often did. Physical contact was not his preferred mode. He held her hand and looked at her face, and Celia stood at the foot of the bed and understood that something was happening between her children that was not for her to narrate or explain. I'm sorry, Mara said. Her voice was rough from the hours of small calling. I didn't think I'd be out there all night. Ren looked at their joined hands. I told you about the path, Mara said. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she stopped and composed herself with the particular visible effort of someone who is determined not to break down in front of a younger sibling. He did not say anything. He held her hand. That was enough. They stayed at the hospital for 3 days. Mara's surgery went well. The surgeon used a plate and 2 screws and said the repair was clean and that in a year the X-ray would show very little evidence of anything. Mara received this information with the solemnity of a person filing it away for later, for the moment when it would stop sounding theoretical and start sounding like her actual life. The physical therapist who came on day 2 said 6 weeks in a boot and then a rehabilitation period, but that at her age, the body's inclination toward recovery was strong. Mara said, so I can go back to the forest. The physical therapist said, eventually, yes, with appropriate preparation. Mara appeared to file this away as well. Ren slept on the small couch in the corner of Mara's room, which was not a thing that hospital protocols strictly permitted, but which the nursing staff appeared to have decided to accommodate. He slept and he woke, and he sat and he looked out the window at the hospital parking lot with the same quality of attention he brought to the view from the kitchen. He ate the food from the hospital cafeteria with his usual methodical approach. And he put his yellow boots on every morning the moment he woke up. And he sat beside Mara's bed and allowed her to talk at him the way she always had, which in the hospital meant mostly talk about what she planned to do when she got home, which was draw maps of the forest from memory, which she had apparently already started doing in the notebook the nurse had brought her. On the second day, while Mara was in physical therapy and Wren was asleep on the couch, Celia drove back to the farm for supplies. She packed a bag. She went into Mara's room. She told herself she was getting the sketchbook. She got the sketchbook. Then she stood in the room for a while, with the sketchbook in her hands, and looked at the room, the desk, the windowsill with the owl skull, the bed with its pushed-back covers that she had not yet made because coming in here to make them had been one of the tasks she had postponed. She looked at the low shelf under the window and the wooden box sitting on it. She picked it up. She did not open it. She turned it over in her hands, feeling its weight. It was an ordinary box, the kind that is sold in craft shops with no particular purpose attached, the right size for letters, for photographs, for the things that a person keeps, not because they are useful, but because putting them somewhere permanent is a way of acknowledging that they happened. The latch was not fully closed. The corner of a folded piece of paper showed at the gap. She stood there for a long moment. Then she set the box back down, picked up the sketchbook, and left. But she thought about the box for the rest of the day. She thought about it on the drive back. She thought about it that night in the chair beside Mara's bed, in the blue-gray dark of the hospital room, with the monitor sounds and the distant hall sounds, and the particular quality of nighttime in a hospital, which is that ordinary time has been replaced by a different system. She thought about what might be in it, and she thought she knew, and she thought about the relationship between knowing and asking, and when asking was necessary, and when it was only for the benefit of the person asking. She asked on the third day, "There's a box on the shelf in your room, under the window." Mara's fork paused. "I wasn't snooping. I noticed it." Mara looked at her eggs. "It's just letters," she said. "Letters I wrote." "To who?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "To different people." She set her fork down. "To Pip, mostly. And some to Dad." Celia kept her expression still. "I didn't send them," Mara said, as though this required clarification. "I just wrote them. When I had something to say." She looked up. "I read them to Wren sometimes, when I'm in his room." Celia thought about her son, arranging his blocks. She thought about the way he was always listening. She thought about the fence and 11 minutes of words and the gray horse at the tree line. "Did you read him the one about the path?" she asked. "About the overlook?" Mara looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," she said, "a few nights ago." Celia nodded. She looked at her hands. She thought about a 9-year-old boy who had not spoken for 4 years, standing at a fence at dawn, talking in full sentences to an animal that appeared from nowhere. She thought about the particular tilt of his head, which was the same tilt he had when he stood in the kitchen doorway listening to Mara sing. She thought about the way he had gotten out of bed when she showed him the note and gone straight to the fence without hesitation, as though he already knew where they needed to go. "He knew," she said, not quite a question. Mara looked at her sister's scrambled eggs. "He always knows," she said quietly. "I just forget sometimes that he's actually listening." There is a quality to grief that most people don't talk about, which is the way it can coexist with gratitude. The way the loss and the relief can occupy the same space without one canceling the other out. Celia had been living in that space for 2 years, since Theo died, and she had gotten somewhat practiced at carrying both at once. She thought about this in the weeks that followed. She thought about it while Mara rehabilitated her leg and complained about the boot, and spent her afternoons drawing elaborate maps of the forest she was not yet allowed to enter. She thought about it while Wren returned to his routines. His blocks, his yellow boots, his long watchful silences that she now understood differently than she had before. He had not spoken again, not in the way she had heard him at the fence. There were sounds, more of them, and different from before, something more deliberate and less reflexive in the way he used them. But the full sentences, the continuous language she had heard that morning, it did not return. She did not reach for it. She had learned, very slowly and very painfully, that reaching for things with Wren changed them. But she started going into his room more in the evenings, not to say anything, just to sit. He didn't object. He arranged his blocks with the particular focused attention she had come to understand as contentment. She sat on the floor near the door, leaning against the wall, and let the quiet be what it was. One evening, about 3 weeks after the hospital, she went in and found that Mara was already there. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, the wooden box open beside her, a folded piece of paper in her hands. She looked up at Celia, and Celia looked at the box, and Mara moved to make room. Celia sat on the floor beside her daughter. Wren arranged his blocks. After a while, Mara unfolded the paper. She didn't look at it. She held it, the way you hold something to feel its weight rather than to read it. "This one's to Dad," she said. "I was going to read it to Wren." She looked at Celia. "You can stay," she said. "If you want." Celia folded her hands in her lap. She looked at her son, at the careful, deliberate movement of his hands, at the particular tilt of his head. "I want," she said. Mara read the letter. It was not long. It was not eloquent in the way that people sometimes describe things as eloquent, with a kind of careful, composed beauty. It was a 12-year-old writing to her dead father about the bird skull on her windowsill, and about the friend who moved away, and about the way the light looked from the overlook when the valley was full of late afternoon, and she was the only person who knew to look at it. It was specific and real, and in places very funny, and in one place so direct and true that the room seemed to hold its breath for a moment. "She misses him," Mara had written, talking about her mother. "She doesn't say it, but she misses you in the way she moved through the house, like she's still making room for someone." Celia closed her eyes. Wren put down a block. When Mara finished, the room was quiet for a while, and then Wren picked up the block again and placed it with a small, precise sound, and the sound was enough. The evening went on. Outside, the light changed. The farm held its familiar silence. And somewhere past the backfield, past the fence, the forest went on doing what forests do, growing and waiting and holding whatever ends up inside it. The gray horse was never identified. The county posted the notice for 6 weeks before taking it down. Celia called every stable and every farm in a 40-mile radius and found nothing. She described it to a woman at the county extension who had been working with horses for 30 years, and the woman listened carefully and without any of the dismissiveness Celia had been bracing for. When Celia finished, the woman was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said finally, "horses do sometimes come from the state forest land. There are feral populations farther north. Not common in this county, but not impossible. They'll range a long way when the conditions are right." She said this in a tone that suggested she believed it. She also said, after a pause, "But I've never heard of one coming to a fence on its own like that. Not with a child. That's not typical behavior for a feral animal." She left it there. Nobody could fully account for it. That was the truth, and Celia had spent enough of her life trying to fully account for things that resisted full accounting that she had developed a certain tolerance for it. Not comfort, exactly, but tolerance. A wildlife biologist at the State University, when Celia described the incident in an online forum months later, responded with a careful and thoughtful post. He said that horses had well-documented sensitivity to human distress signals, cortisol levels, micro-expressions, altered breathing patterns that could, in certain circumstances, produce approach behaviors that looked like something other than what they were. He said that infrasound, at frequencies below the range of human hearing, was detectable by horses and could communicate states of agitation or urgency over considerable distances. He said the behavior at the fence on the first morning, the apparent attentiveness, the stillness, the positioning, was consistent with an animal that had perceived something and was responding to it, even if the nature of that perception was not fully understood. He said the second morning and the leading behavior through the forest was harder to account for. He said that some feral horses developed detailed cognitive maps of their territories and could navigate complex terrain efficiently. He said it was not impossible that the animal had used a familiar route. He said, "I want to be careful not to over-explain this, because I think over-explaining it would actually obscure what's interesting about it." He did not have an explanation for the timing. Celia read his response twice and then closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table for a long while. She thought about Wren at the fence, talking in sentences. She thought about what 11 minutes of language might contain. What a boy who had been accumulating the world in silence for 4 years might have to say when he finally found something that would listen. She thought about Mara reading her letters aloud in his room, telling him about a path that descended toward a ravine, about a branch that went further than she had gone, about the kind of path that kept going even when it stopped looking like one. He had known. He had known the same way he knew everything he was never credited for knowing, because he had been listening when no one thought to check. She would sit with this for a long time. She would not arrive at a conclusion, and she had made her peace with that. What she understood was what she had. Her daughter was alive. Her son had led her there. And something that came from nowhere and went back to nowhere, an animal with no name and no owner that moved through the world with a different kind of attention than the kind that had names, had made it possible. Whether you called that coincidence or something else depended on things that were not finally answerable. And Celia had spent enough of her life insisting on answers to things that didn't have them. She let it be what it was. The following spring, Mara's leg was fully healed. The surgeon confirmed it with an X-ray and said the bone had knit cleanly, and that in most respects it was as though the break had never happened, which Celia understood was the medical version of that statement and not the actual version. The actual version was that it had happened, and it had changed things, and the things it had changed were not all bad. Mara had spent the winter drawing maps. Not maps of anywhere she had been, maps of the forest from memory, elaborated with details she had accumulated on her afternoon trips, annotated with notes about species and formations, and the locations of things she had found. The overlook was there, labeled in her particular handwriting, with the shelf of rock and the initials in the stone, and the view of the valley marked with a small notation that said, "Light best after 4 in October." The lower path was there too, marked in a different color. She had drawn it accurately. The turnoff, the descent, the ravine floor, the boulder. She had not labeled the boulder. She came to Celia on a Saturday in April and said she wanted to go back to the overlook. She said she wanted to go with Celia. She said she wanted to bring the box. They went on a morning when the new leaves were just opening. The forest in that particular condition of early spring, where everything is so green it looks implausible. The light coming through the new canopy in a quality that is softer and more diffuse than summer, and somehow more interior, as though the light is still deciding what to do with itself. Celia had not been in the forest since October. She had thought, through the winter, about whether she would be able to go back, and had not resolved it until she was actually walking the path and finding that it was the same path in the same forest, and that the thing she had been afraid of finding there, some residue of the worst morning of her recent life, was not what she found. What she found was just the forest, doing what the forest does, which is not waiting for anything. They climbed the ridge. The hemlock grove was the same. The initials in the stone were the same. The valley below the overlook was full of April light, and they sat on the flat shelf of rock, and Mara opened the box. She took the letters out one by one. She read them in the order she had written them, which was not quite chronological, but had its own logic. The early ones were short and factual, and had the quality of someone learning a form. The later ones were longer, more confident, less careful about what they said. She read the one about the overlook, about the light and the initials, and the feeling of being the only person who knew to be there. She read the one about Pip. She read several to her father, and her voice was steady through the first of them, and then less steady through the second, and then steady again by the third, in the way that people get steadier as they go, as the weight becomes distributed rather than concentrated. Celia sat beside her and listened. She was listening in the way she had learned from her son, which was without the kind of listening that requires you to respond, without the self-monitoring that takes some part of your attention away from the other person. She was entirely there. She did not look at her phone. She did not think about what she would say when Mara finished. She listened. Wren had stayed home. The forest was not his terrain, or not in the way it was Mara's. And when they had asked him, not expecting, just offering, he had looked at the tree line for a moment and then gone back to his blocks. He had his own territories, his own methods, which were not this kind of method, but were not less than this kind of method. She had learned that too. When they returned in the late afternoon, the sun dropping toward the western hills, and the farm taking on the particular amber quality of the last hour of April daylight, he was at the fence. He was standing at the fence the way he sometimes stood there now, not every day, but often enough that Celia had stopped registering it as unusual. His hands on the top rail, loose, his head tilted slightly right, his yellow boots in the damp late afternoon grass. He was not talking. He was not humming. He was watching the tree line with that quality of attention she had never been able to fully describe, the attention that was not passive, not scanning, not searching, the attention of someone who has already located the thing they are looking for and is simply keeping track of it. She got out of the truck and crossed the yard to the fence and stood beside him. The forest, at this hour, was doing what it always did. The new leaves moved in a small wind that didn't reach the yard. Somewhere in there, the creek was moving over the same stones it had moved over all winter, and the hemlock roots were doing what roots do, and the initials in the stone were there as they had always been, patient and illegible from this distance. Everything was in its place. Everything was exactly as it had been. She stood beside her son and looked at the tree line. She did not ask him what he was watching. She did not need to ask, and she had not needed to for some time now, because she had learned, slowly, the way she had learned everything about him, imperfectly and incompletely, and in the ongoing way of learning that never fully arrives, that what Wren was doing when he stood at the fence and looked at the forest was not a mystery. It was not nothing. It was not absence. It was keeping watch. She understood this the way you understand things that cannot be said directly, not through explanation, but through the accumulated weight of attention paid over years. Through all the mornings and evenings, she had stood in the kitchen and watched him at this fence and gradually, without quite deciding to, started to understand what she was seeing. She looked at the gap in the fence corner, the place where the wire had been removed, the place they had walked through, all three of them, on an October morning when everything that mattered was still missing. The gap was still there. Grass grew through it. A sparrow had used the corner post as a perch at some point and left the evidence. Wren was looking at the gap. He was standing at the fence the way he sometimes stood there now, his hands on the top rail, looking at the tree line. Celia watched him from the driveway for a moment before she got out of the truck. His posture was loose. His head was at its characteristic tilt. He was not talking. He was not humming. He was just watching the field, watching the forest, watching whatever it was that he saw when he looked in that direction. She got out of the truck. She crossed the yard to the fence and stood beside him and looked at the tree line. The forest was still bright with late afternoon light, the new leaves translucent and almost yellow-green at the edges, and the field between them was damp from the mornings, rain and full of that particular smell of April soil and cold and something beginning. She did not ask him what he was looking for. She knew he would not answer, and she had stopped needing him to. She stood beside her son and looked at the forest and let the evening come. And whether Wren was watching for the horse, or watching for something else, or watching for nothing at all, except the satisfaction of watching, she could not say. But she noticed, as she stood there, that his gaze was not moving across the tree line the way a person's gaze moves when it is scanning or searching. It was fixed, specific, directed. He was looking at one place in particular. She looked at the same place. It was the gap in the fence where the wire had been removed years ago. The gap they had walked through, the three of them, the boy, the horse, the woman, on a cold morning in October when everything that mattered was still missing. Wren looked at that gap for a long time. Then he looked up at her. Then he looked back at the gap. And Celia understood, with the specific and wordless certainty of a mother who had spent 9 years learning to listen without words, that he was not waiting for the horse to come back. He was keeping the way open, just in case.